Good evening and welcome to Dessert and Dish. Dessert and Dish is a weekly interview segment inviting real people to dish on the real challenges and blessings of living faithful lives. Dessert and Dish features a weekly dessert, often something local or homemade, because dessert always makes conversations better and because we all need a little reminder of the sweetness of the kingdom of God already at work in our midst. I'm really excited this evening to welcome Archdeacon Marion Vincett to Dessert and Dish. I'm so excited to get to talk to you this evening, Marion. Marion comes with a very fancy title, but Marion is just such an incredible friend and guide and mentor, not just to me, but to many of us. So I know everybody's going to enjoy and appreciate this conversation along with me. Welcome, Marion.
Thank you. I didn't know I was going to be interviewed by Princess Leia. But...
Well, I was saying before we started the interview that it is a little bit of a tell when we are actually recording Dessert and Dish for this week, because I do have my Star Wars theme going on. So people who are Star Wars fans can deduce when we actually did this recording based on my hairstyle. But we can both access our inner warrior princess, Marion, and have a great conversation tonight.
Look forward to it.
Before we get into our conversation, though, we do need to introduce our desserts. So, Marion, what are you eating over in your neck of the woods today?
I'm eating a butter almond cake from my favorite Dutch bakery in Beamsville. It's flat. It's not gooey like some of the desserts you've had on Dish and Dessert or Dessert and Dish, but it's the kind of thing I like. It's more biscuity than gooey, but it's very almondy and it's gluten-free.
Oh my gosh, well, that sounds delicious. I have something kind of fun over here. So this is Amish friendship loaf, Amish cinnamon friendship loaf. So about 12 days ago, a neighbor showed up on my doorstep with a bag of starter that sat fermenting on my counter for 10 days before it then got a bunch of stuff added to it. And then I was able to take starters over to a few other people and mix up the rest of the loaf and bake it up. So I was able to set aside a little corner of the friendship loaf that didn't get gobbled up by my kids, who find this cinnamon friendship loaf quite delicious. So
sounds like a sourdough starter. That's great fun.
Yeah, it's definitely fun, and I get to do it all over again in 10 days because there's another starter bag sitting fermenting on my counter now. So it's the gift that keeps on. I also have a cup of tea. I think you have some tea as well. That definitely goes well with dessert too. So Mary, for those in our community who don't know you, let's do a bit of an introduction. You currently serve as honorary assistant here at St. George's, but you have a whole wealth of experience in church leadership, both at the parish level and at the diocesan level. You were a beloved and very effective parish priest. And then you went on to become a beloved and effective executive archdeacon of the diocese for a number of years. You were my first point of contact when I was looking to be ordained in the Diocese of Niagara. I remember meeting you at Trinity College at a lunch that was held after chapel one day, and I was so intimidated to because I so wanted to come to Niagara. But you, from that moment, and all of the moments since, you've been nothing but down to earth and supportive and caring. And like I said at the opening, such a tremendous mentor and friend to me and to so many others. So let's start kind of near the beginning of this impressive trajectory in church life. I've talked to a number of people who have experienced, I think, something that you experienced too, which is that you were kind of on one track living a particular version of life, and that got somewhat interrupted by a sense of calling into priesthood and into the church. So can you just share with us a little bit about how that worked, how you sensed God speaking into your life, and what that discernment looked like for you?
It probably goes back quite a long way. I mean, much further than the 1970s when I finally started to respond, because I grew up in post-war England, as you can probably tell from my accent, and you know, I don't know how to explain it, but the life was very, very different from anything that probably even existed here in those days after the war. You know, we were still rationed. We were still, women's role was incredibly limited. And if you've ever seen anything about the Bletchley women that left Bletchley having had really important, highly intelligent and useful jobs, and then suddenly had to go back to being housewives, that was the kind of world that I grew up in. Okay.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So my only options after school, and I went to a girls' high school, were really becoming a teacher, a nurse, or a secretary. You either belonged in a nurse's uniform or behind a typewriter or as a teacher.
Right, right.
The only people I ever saw in truly leadership positions as women were all single. You couldn't be married and, you know, be the headmistress. You had to be a single woman.
Okay. Wow.
So when I went off to university in 1961, I was one of very few women who went to university. Even in the arts, I was still a very small minority of the numbers of people going. And I was blessed to go to Durham. So I found myself about 300 miles away from home, which was a lot for me in those days. We didn't have a car and I had to use trains. And I got to Durham, and Durham was magical. It was absolutely magical. I found myself studying English and history, and then choosing to add religious education or theology in my latter years there. And you know, the cathedral, the whole Celtic thing up there is very impressive and magical. And I was really caught by that whole thing, you know, the stories of Cuthbert and Bede and all of those wonderful people who existed in that world. And I really did feel a call to be serving God in some really intense way. But the only way I could have done it to be totally intense, I guess, would have been to be a missionary or a nun. And I didn't feel called to either of them.
Yeah.
I ended up becoming a teacher and getting married, and then living in Cambridge because my husband was working on his PhD. And that was also another blessing, because Cambridge in the mid-60s, which was when we were there, was a really vibrant place theologically. I don't know what it's like now, but it was then. We went to the university church, and they had a wonderful Sunday evening service, which was a bit like your Advent Cafe, with lots of exciting preachers coming in from all different disciplines. And, you know, sort of rock music of the 60s going on in the background. And the place would be absolutely stacked full of students, the galleries, the whole church. It was exciting. So I joined that congregation, and I got thoroughly involved in doing pastoral visits with seniors, and I just loved it. And then we went to Canada, and we went to BC, and I taught in BC. Of course, I couldn't teach religious education there. And I got involved with a little church in Burnaby where the guy that was the rector had been the chaplain at UBC. So again, I'm really fortunate. I was on the cutting edge of liturgy change and all of that kind of stuff. When our first child was born, she was baptized in the main Sunday service and not on a Sunday afternoon hat affair. And I just felt this was where I belonged. And then we went back to England, and it was an utter disaster. Left the church because it was so far behind and so stuck in the old ways. You know, children weren't welcome. I didn't want to be there unless my children could be welcome, so I stopped going.
Wow. Oh,
it was just incredible. Yeah. So I learned a lot about how to be the kind of church I wanted to church.
Yeah.
we came back to Canada and we came to Ontario and we landed at St. Mark's in Orangeville. Very shortly after we moved out that way, Paul Brillinger became the rector. And Paul and I became good friends and talked about theology, because of course I had all the 60s books. I had, John Robinson's books and Tillich's books and Bortman's books and all of that stuff.
Yeah.
Great conversations. And he wanted me to become a lay reader. This was in the days when women were not lay readers. So I ended up with a great deal of hesitancy, because the kids were little, becoming a lay reader. And not long after that, Paul Brillinger left and Paul Taylor arrived, and he just kept on with the same kind of theme. So I ended up doing pastoral care in the congregation. And at that point he said to me, so when are you going to, do the right thing and start thinking about applying to a theological college? I'd already been a lay reader and a warden, which I thought was very good training to become a parish priest.
Yeah.
And also a lay delegate to synod, I may say. And so eventually, with a lot of reluctance because of the kids' ages, I Trinity. And that was when I guess my calling, I wasn't certain, but my calling was getting much closer to being certain. And the response from the congregation was so encouraging that kind of made it happen, Yeah. And that's what happened. So yes, I got involved. Now, from the family point of view, I don't think Paul was really surprised. I think he's always known that something like this might happen. He's always been a feminist, so there was never any issue with that.
Right.
He was very uncertain about his role, because the only roles that he'd seen was women, and they'd often kind of unpaid curates, the wives of clergy.
Yeah, truly.
So he wasn't sure about that role. But what he ended up saying and telling people was that he ministered to the minister. And so he didn't join the men's club, but he ministered to the minister.
Yeah. That's amazing. And it seems like, the description of your call just sounds so organic, like such a combination of God speaking to you through, like, just that pull toward Christian community, and like finding that joy and finding that fit there, but then also like through the affirmation of others and their ability to see this in you too. That's amazing. And so, like, what year was it that you were ordained, Marion?
I took 4.5 years to do my Master of Divinity, because I was commuting from near Grand Valley, which is a very long way to Toronto.
Yeah.
And I was working in the parish for some of the time. And I also had 3 kids and a husband, and I wasn't going to let that whole thing destroy my marriage and my family. So I deliberately took my time. So it was 1989 when I finally got ordained.
Okay. All right. So, I think the Anglican Church of Canada started ordaining women in 1976, I think.
77, something like that. Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So, you were still very much on the leading edge of women in ministry. I have to say, I have always looked up to you as just such a great leader in our church. But it has also really mattered to me to be able to look up to you as a female leader in the church. We say it a lot, especially lately, but representation really does matter. Like, it really does matter to be able to see people that are like us, in leadership, in order to kind of make us feel like we can lead too. And that came up in my conversation with Sheila and Kathy a couple of weeks ago too. As much as you're willing to share, I'd love to hear your reflections about being kind of on the leading edge of female leadership in some of those higher, diocesan positions as well, because it probably was there probably weren't many executive archdeacons who were women.
There weren't any archdeacons. It was a very lonely start, actually.
Yeah.
I had had only been ordained 5 years. And I was at a clergy conference one evening at Geneva Park. And I was sitting on the edge watching what was going on, having had a very busy sort of extrovert day. And I'm sitting with my glass of wine, and Bishop Walter came and sat next to me. And he looked at me and he said, Marion, I'd like to appoint you as Archdeacon of Greater Wellington. And I said, oh, no, you can't do that.
That's such a funny reaction.
You know, there were a number of reasons for why I said that. One was because my only experience of archdeacons had always been the kind of trollop Mr. Archdeacon model, you know. And the second was that I just knew how the clergy would react, because I'm so new in ministry and I didn't need opposition in my life.
Yeah.
So anyway, I said, oh, I don't think I could do the job the way it's been done. And he said, I don't want you to do the job the way it's been done. You can hear me saying this. He said, I want you to do the job the way Ralph Spence does the job in Trafalgar. He said, have a chat with Ralph and then tell me what you think. So Ralph and I walked around Geneva Park the next morning after breakfast, you know, in the days when Ralph could still walk. And he said to me, you know, the way I do the job is to meet with the clergy and have coffee with them or have lunch with them and listen to them and act as a pastor to them. And I know you can do that.
Yeah, in spades.
So that's what I ended up doing. But I said to Bishop Walter at the end of that conference, I'll do it, but don't announce it here. I couldn't handle it. He didn't. He announced it later on in the summer when a lot of the clergy were away and it kind of didn't sort of hit the fan in the way that it might have done at the clergy conference. Right. I knew that position, and of course there was. I was not only, I think, the first woman in Canada to be an archdeacon, but I hadn't been ordained very long.
Yeah.
And that, you know, I don't think that in many professions, but particularly in the church, we were ready to recognize that other forms of experience mattered and could be useful. Yeah. So that's what happened anyway. So that was my first experience. And then later, when Bishop Ralph had been elected, he said to me, I'd like you to come and be my executive officer. And I really didn't want to. I didn't want to spend all my time in an office position. I loved being a parish priest. But I could see why he needed it. He said 30% of my clergy are women, and I want a woman in that synod office to talk to them. Yeah. So what happened was that many of the women would come in and they'd talk to Bishop Ralph about their careers and their parishes, and then they'd come and sit and talk to me about their families and their issues at home.
Wow.
So that was, and I could see the value of the role at that point.
Well, and I think you really did take that pastoral, personable piece that Ralph named when you were talking about being a regional archdeacon into that role as executive officer. And for those of you who are less familiar with our Anglican hierarchy system, like the executive archdeacon is generally the right hand help and support and teammate of the bishop. And you oversee a great deal of the raising up of leaders and the supporting of leaders in our church. So in so many ways, it seems like you were just custom made for that role. Yeah, I'd kind of be interested in, you know, you were very reluctant to take on that role, but like, what did you enjoy about that position, and what did you find challenging in that position?
Well, I love the part that you just mentioned. I mean, I really love teaching and the students and just spending time getting to know people and hear about their call and helping them to discern it. And when they came back to me after they'd done their clinical pastoral units, I'd love to listen to what had been going on and how much they'd learned and how excited they were. You know, all of those kinds of things that was by far the nicest part of my job. no question. I really enjoyed working with Bishop Ralph because he is so good-humored and so funny and so positive and so supportive and encouraging. It's really hard not to enjoy working with somebody like that.
That's so true.
And I felt very blessed to have him in the next office, you know. And when he'd shout, "Archdeacon," I'd run in and we'd have, you know, heart to hearts. We dealt with some really difficult things. There's no question, you know. He had to close some parishes, and we'd listened to parish councils and wardens bemoaning, grieving, angry, unrealistic. You know, it was a very, very challenging time, and lots of emotion. I was always grateful I had my friend Rick Jones around to share this stuff with, because he was part of all of these decisions. And Rick and I went back to Trinity days and commuting together, and that made a huge difference in my life. And I was very grateful to him. But we certainly had some difficult things to deal with. Mm. And at the end of it all, I was quite burned out when I retired from the Senate. No question. I wasn't sure whether I wanted anything to do with the church again. Wow. And it took a while to come back and to be able to, you know, rediscover my pastoral skills and maybe even my preaching skills, do some interims. And I enjoyed them. But it took me a while. That's what burnout does, I think.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that says a lot that that you felt that way, and I'm certainly grateful that you were able to recover from that sense of burnout and continue to contribute to the life of the church. I wonder whether we can just circle back to the female piece, mm-hmm. being on the leading edge of female leadership in the church. I mean, you named the loneliness, and you named that you felt some sense of opposition, maybe because of your number of years of ordained ministry, but maybe there were some other issues at work as well. I mean, how do you think our church has coped overall with adapting over the past 40 plus years to women in ministry?
I think now it's doing very well, but it took a long. You can look, you only have to think about the prayers on Sunday morning when we have a female primate, a female metropolitan and a female bishop in this diocese, but it took us a long while to get there. Mm-hmm. And I'm very happy that we have gotten there, but for the first few years it was quite challenging. It really was. I think one of the things for me was even, how do I dress? You know, what do I wear that looks feminine and is still recognizably clerical? You know, those kinds of things we didn't have any models for. The earlier clergy that I had seen, and sort of mostly in the distance, female clergy, weren't like me, let's put it that way. and so I had to find that out for myself. Now, there were others around my time who were ordained close with me, or around the time that I was ordained, and I think we were all working on it together.
Yeah. I mean, I have not been ordained as long as you, obviously, but I can really appreciate some of those same challenges. There have been times I have felt quite lonely in ministry. And yeah, like I feel like a lot of how we kind of attack everything from clothing to, you know, bigger things as well is just let's take the model of what it is for men and like mm-hmm. fit into that, right? Like
we do medicine, we do it for all kinds of things, don't we? Yes.
Yeah, that's right.
I'll tell you, the first archdeacons meeting I went to, this is a funny story. The first archdeacon I went to at the cathedral before it became Cathedral Place, and were gathering, and I'd come from quite a long way because I was up in Greater Wellington, and I got down there and they were just having coffee and they were all chatting, and two of them were celebrating 30 years of ordination the day before. This is a Monday. And when I got there, they were all chatting about how many years they'd been ordained. And in I walk. And they all sort of shut up and looked a little embarrassed. And then I said, well, I've been married 30 years. Does that count? I didn't know what to say. It was like I had to break the ice somehow.
Yeah.
And one or two of them were very supportive, I have to say, right from the beginning. By no means all of them, but one or two of them were, yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
It didn't take long though, that they, once we started meeting on a regular basis and conversing about our regions, and I felt more included each meeting. So yeah, it was okay. But I was still the only woman.
Yeah, yeah. We talked about this a little bit, Kathy and Sheila and I, which is that it does feel like even now, and I mean, this is changing, as you said, it's definitely changing, but it's not like we just walk in the room and respect and authority is kind of handed to us, right? Like you have to earn it. And that's not always a bad thing. Like it's not a bad thing to have to show what you have to contribute and gain people's trust over the course of time. And probably the church is better served if that's the model that we use in terms of leadership right across the church, whether it's...
I was going to say, yeah, that would be in a parish too. Any kind of leadership today, I think you have to earn.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, nothing wrong with that, but it can be a bit stark at times in ministry, that it can feel like it's a very different starting place for men versus women, even now to some degree.
Yes, I'm sure. I remember when I was first ordained and I went to be the rector of my first parish, and I don't think I had any problem with the men, but it was the women. And it was mostly women either of my age or a little older than me who were doing a lot of the work in the parish, as they always did. So, you know, the Altar Guild and the ACW and all of that stuff. And I think possibly it was partly jealousy because they had given up their careers when they'd married and become housewives, and, you know, I don't know, I never discussed it with them, but there was certainly quite a lot of pushback to start with.
Yeah.
It was for them, I guess, to have a female up front on a Sunday morning, but it took a while.
Yeah. I think that's kind of a hashtag, right? It takes a while.
That's right, exactly.
We're still working on it. We're still working on the agenda, but yeah.
Well, for a long time, when Bishop Ralph would meet with parochial committees, he'd hear from somebody on the committee, oh, don't send us a woman.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a thing. Again, like the dial does move. It takes time. And again, like I think of my own experience, that, you know, by no means was female priesthood new by the time I was ordained, but the number of places I've gone into where I was the first woman who had preached in that space or had led in that space, it's not insignificant.
Yeah. Well, it's not surprising, is it? If you know, the average tenure is 5 to 7 years or something, it's gonna take a while, isn't it?
Yeah. That's right.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, one of the things that we have in our favor in this context of dessert and dish is we have the perspective of hindsight. I just think of you being ordained in 1989 and some of the things that have been controversial issues in the church over the decades. You know, I know Bishop Walter has talked about moving the altar here at St. George's and that being a big deal. Is there anything that sticks out in your mind a big controversial decision that you had to make at some point that in the perspective of hindsight doesn't seem like it should have been a big deal at all?
I was ordained when the prayer book issues were still being debated, and
Yeah.
people were bringing in the BAS, and the BCP was taking a back seat, and there was a lot of pushback from that. And my predecessor in the parish had already introduced the BAS, but I don't think it was well accepted. So I was still working on that when I got there. And I used my teaching background and to talk to them, to teach them basically about the differences. Not so much, well, the liturgical difference reflected the theological differences. So that's where the teacher in me came out, and it was quite useful. And they said to me, why didn't someone tell us this stuff before, And so we kind of got through it together. But being a female was a big enough change, I thought, for me to do any changing at the beginning. It was just for them,
Yeah, you were the change.
I changed, absolutely, no question. And I knew it, how could I not be?
Yeah.
Yeah. What else? They had already pulled the altar out. What happened, the other thing was always a big problem for people was how should they address me?
Yeah. Well, and what did you decide?
Well, I certainly wasn't going to be mother. I told them that when I first arrived. I got my own kids, I don't need any more.
Yeah.
I said, I'm Marion. I'm Mrs. Vincett. I'm Reverend Vincett, if you want to call me that, but please don't call me mother. And most of the time they called me Marion. That seemed to work quite well. I was baptized Marion. It was fine. Then, of course, when I became Archdeacon, they loved using that title.
I mean, it is a good fancy title. Yeah, I think it's funny to look back on those stumbling blocks that have tripped us up in the past. And I mean, there are really big stumbling blocks like the role of women in church, like that. That was a big deal to negotiate. But it is funnier to think back to things like which book we're going to use and where the altar is going to be and thing. Maybe funny isn't the right word, just so much as hopeful. I find it hopeful to think, okay, like we've been through lots of issues that people have held a variety of opinions, very like passionate opinions on, and we've made it through. So
they were very important times, and I mean, there's still some reticence about letting go of using a book, as you know. And I've never been a person of a book, but a lot of people are. And it's so much part of who they are in their church, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, that's the thing is that we feel these things so deeply because they are part of how we navigate our spirituality and our relationship with God. So it's no wonder that they elicit such big feelings. So, okay, you've had lots of different experiences and lots of different leadership experiences. So what do you think the church needs to be doing or thinking about right now? What do you want the church to be doing in response to our people's needs, the needs of the world? What do you most want the church to be hanging on to right now?
Well, I think the church needs to, let me go back. COVID has given us all an opportunity to think about what's really important in our lives and in the lives of the church as well. And I would say that community is very important in church. It always has been to me, which means that parishes are important. I would like to see us put a lot more money and effort and training into into the parish networks, and probably less on ecclesial structure and meetings and travel and all of those kinds of things. I think we have far too many levels in the Anglican Church, and although it's always been important that leaders meet, I think we found that we can do that with now online meetings and Zooms and stuff, and it's not the same, but it's important that we do it and that we save the money so that we can use it on other things. I think the parish and its subgroups, like our STEP program and other outreach that exists around the diocese, are where the rubber meets the road. And if we're going to survive as a church, we need to put our efforts into that.
Yeah, that's really well said. And I appreciate your saying that from the perspective of having had the opportunity to see close up the various levels and why they're important and what they do and how they shape the church and where the direction needs to be right now. So that's really helpful to hear. You said that you came away from your work in the Synod office wondering whether you wanted to be part of the church at all. And clearly you have continued to be part of the church, as I said, for which we are very grateful. What gives you hope? What makes you hopeful about the life of the church, about ministry, about directions that we're going right now?
I think I probably put it all in my little homily last week, actually, but what gives me hope are people like you and Scott and Matt and Brad, people who are young and still believe in the church and want to be working in the church and can see the value of what they're doing and are sharing their deep faith with people new and old within the congregations. And if we didn't have people like you, I don't think I would have that kind of hope. Because, you know, it's definitely an institution that's dying in many ways. It's not necessarily dying in all ways, I hope, but it's certainly dying in some ways, and some of those ways we needed to let go. But the fact that there are young people like you coming in with a desire to reform it, to change it, to update it, if you will, whatever the word is, to resuscitate it, is very exciting and hopeful for me. So thank you.
Oh, that's so beautifully said. Yeah, I love that, and I love that just framing that cycle of death and rebirth in the context of hope, because you're right, like there are always it's, as Bob Dylan says, if you're not busy being born, you're busy dying, right? Like there's always pieces that we need to let go of in order to let new pieces be born. So yeah, I really appreciate that. Marion, it is such a delight to talk to you, and we do get to work together, but we haven't gotten to spend a lot of like one-on-one time together over the past 14 months. So it's awfully nice just to sit down and have a cup of tea and some dessert with you. I hope that everybody will join us next week for my conversation with Allison Lynn. Allison is well known to our Advent Cafe community, one of our musical leaders and occasional preachers. And Allison has just been published in a new book of Easter essays called Easter Stories and More. So I'm looking forward to sharing that conversation with all of you as we talk about this and other creative ventures going on in her life. Thank you all for joining us tonight and for being part of how together we get to eat and talk and participate in the sweetness of life.
Thank you, Martha.
Thanks, Marion.